Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. I have a question for you. What motivated you to involve your ex-spouse in your current relationship? And not just involve your ex-spouse in your current relationship. Why do you insist on allowing them to affect your current relationship with your new spouse? You say, well, I don't know that I'm doing that. Well, we're going to talk about that today. And we're going to talk about why you struggle with mistrust in your blended family relationship. So hi, I'm Jim Cunningham. I'm always glad that you've joined us. Faith Influencer is our podcast, and it's about blended families. And I am committed to building blended families. I have a blended family and have had for almost 15 years now. So let's build this together. We're walking through those things that affect our family. And there are several things. If you were to list them, the number one detriment that we find in blended families is discussions, and I put that in quotations, about children. That's the number one thing. We've dealt with that already. I'm sure we'll come back to it again. But in the top 5 for sure, you always have the issue of mistrust. And so it's like a residual effect. It's like a carryover effect from your previous relationship, especially if you were the one who was hurt. So let's look at those. Here are some of the aspects of trust. One, if you come from a relationship where someone cheated on you, you've got some built-in mistrust. Could be coming from that. Or if you were the one who cheated on your spouse and now you're in a new relationship, you carry over mistrust. You say, how can I carry over mistrust? I was the culprit. I was the one who did it, because it takes the form of judging. Let me describe this to you. I'm going to give you a strange example, but you'll get it. Let's say I'm driving down the road and there's a lady who's hurt on the side of the road. She's literally in the ditch. I stop. I help her. She's bleeding. I put her in my car and I take off down the road, and I pass someone that I know who sees another lady in my car. And they call my wife and say, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband is cheating. Why would they do that? Because that's the definition of judging. Now get this, the definition of judging is that's what you would be doing if you were in that situation. You would be cheating if you were in that situation. So you project that on other people. Well, that's what we do in marriage if you come in as the cheater and you're building a new relationship. Now, I'm not judging you for that. God will forgive you of that. But here's your tendency. Your tendency is that you're going to think that your wife may be doing something, or your husband may be doing something they shouldn't, but it's because that's what you did. That's called judging. That's one of the carryovers of mistrust. Here's another one. One of the issues of blended families is that mistrust explodes because we have a lack of communication, and I really want to talk about that today. So let's walk through some of these. All right, one is you're hurt by an ex-spouse. That's just going to happen. And so you're going to have a tendency to have mistrust. But let me ask you, how fair is this? How fair is it to say to your spouse, you didn't hurt me, but you're going to pay for it? You didn't hurt me, but I don't trust you. How fair is that? It's this word in the world of psychology called transference. Here's what that means. It means that you redirect your feelings that you have about your ex onto your current spouse. That's transference. You transfer it over. Sometimes you do that subconsciously. As a matter of fact, I'm going to say most of the time you're not intending to do that. Most of the time, it's a subconscious thing. You may not even know it. As a matter of fact, you may have wondered, why is it that I sometimes have trouble giving myself to my spouse? Why do I withhold emotions from them? Or why do I have these feelings about them when they really didn't do anything? It's transference. It's carrying over those feelings from that previous relationship. We need to deal with that. I want to give you, just for free here, a couple of steps to deal with those issues. Here's one. You're not in that situation anymore. That previous situation where you were hurt, you're not in that situation anymore. In counseling, this is what we do. There have been times when I've counseled with people who lost a loved one to a tragic accident. I'm thinking of a parent who lost a child in a tragic car accident. They could not get over that. When we sit down and walk through that tragedy after some months of dealing with it in counseling, here is what set that person free. Not that they ever lost the grieving or the hurt, but they had to realize this, that their child that they lost in that tragic accident was no longer in that situation. Their child was no longer in that situation of that tragic accident. It happened, but they're not there now. It's that understanding that helped them move on and begin to deal with it. I want you to do that in your new relationship. I want you to realize that previous relationship that was so filled with anger and hurt and created all this mistrust, you're not in that situation now. So don't carry it over into this situation. Number two, here's a second way you can deal with this is this idea of transference, this unfair idea of taking your feelings and putting them on your current spouse. Another way you can deal with that is stay in the present. You're going to have the tendency, we all do in different areas, but you're going to have the tendency to allow your emotions to drift back to that previous relationship. Can't do it. You got to stay in the present. And then the last thing on that is I want you to learn the triggers. There are things that sort of set off those feelings, that idea of mistrust, those emotions. So learn to find those triggers. Now, here's the secret. Here's the secret. You're in a new relationship. You have a blended family. And I'm always going to argue that the foundation of a blended family is the marriage. So that's why throughout our podcast, we will keep coming back to the marriage. But our blended families are going to be solid when we have solid communication. That also is going to be how you overcome this mistrust, better communication. Now, let me describe my own relationship. So my wife and I, this may be the opposite of yours, but in our relationship, and by the way, let me say, she knows I'm saying this. She's not going to watch this podcast and then I'm in trouble. She knows why I'm saying this. Matter of fact, if she were on this podcast, and she will be on one in the future, but if she was on this podcast today, she'd say absolutely true, because we do talk about this. She's not a communicator. I'm the communicator. Now, it's normally the other way around, I think, but not in this case. In our case, I'm the communicator and she is not. Well, we have to have communication. You have to have better communication. That's foundational to a good marriage. That's foundational to a great blended family. However, that's not her thing. She doesn't communicate. She doesn't notice things. So literally the other day, preparing for this podcast, I said, let's talk about something. It'll help me with this podcast because other people struggle with communication as well. Let's talk about why you struggle with communication. And so this was my question to her, and this was my assumption. I said, so is it because of your previous relationship and because of the hurt that came out of that and what was done? Is that why? Because we're going to talk about that. We're carrying over that mistrust and putting it on your current spouse. And she said, that's probably part of it. But she said, I was raised different. I was raised in a house of all boys. And in our house, you didn't cry. You didn't show emotion. I mean, if you were hurt or your feelings were hurt and you started to cry, you were just told to dry it up. You weren't allowed to express feelings or allowed to express emotions or allowed to really communicate. You didn't sit down with a parent and say, this is how I feel. That didn't happen in her household. So that was just the way she was raised. So I don't know about your situation. I don't know if it's you, the husband, or you, the wife, what do you do when you realize that communication is foundational, especially to the extra issues that come with blended families? If communication is invaluable, what do? Listen, get better. There are no excuses. Get better. Learn to communicate. Learn to express yourself. And what happens if you don't do it, then you're gonna begin to miss things that are going on in your relationship, and your spouse is not going to understand how you feel about things, because I promise you, they're not a mind reader. Your spouse is not a mind reader unless you communicate how you feel about something. So here's the trip. This is the road we take. If you're not a communicator and you don't express yourself and communicate to your spouse, then what happens is there's something that hurts your feelings. You will get your feelings hurt, or there's something that they do that bothers you, and they don't even know it. They're unaware that they've done this, but it goes unresolved because you don't communicate about it. And when it goes unresolved, do you know what you do? Unknowingly, you begin to develop feelings of bitterness because you're having needs going unmet, all because we're not good communicators. So I communicate with my wife about communicating, about being better communicators. I'm going to encourage you to do the same thing. So it's hard. I am not discounting the hurt or the pain that you may have gone through, how difficult it might be to communicate. But I want you to think about this. Your remarriage, one, is not a business. It's not a business. It's not a business deal. Your remarriage is not so you can have stability. It's not so that your kids can be in a better environment. Those are all great benefits, but it's not a business deal. And neither is it a great opportunity. It's not a great opportunity of finding someone, because they say after 45 or so, the likelihood of finding a match is not very good. So it becomes a great opportunity. No, marriage is not a great opportunity. That's not how you look at it. One, your marriage, your remarriage, that's the foundation for your blended family, is a vow. It is a vow. What does that mean? That means that you've committed to each other. That means that you've committed to each other. So what does that mean? Your heart's safe. You would not have married them, surely, if you didn't feel that your heart could be safe with them. So just realize that you've made a vow and your heart's safe. It's safe for you to be honest. It's safe for you to communicate how you feel. Do you know what that's going to do for your blended family to communicate like that? So it's a vow, but it's also a union. It's a union between two people. This is what I'm going to keep fighting for. You say, I know that was true of my first marriage, and we went through the whole ceremony, and we shared our vows, and we said all of these things, and two people are becoming one. That was my first marriage. Listen, that's your second marriage. That's this marriage. It's the same. You're making a vow, and it's the union of two people. You have to look at it like that. So it is a safe space. You are in a new relationship. And do you know what's natural? It is natural in a new, loving relationship with someone that you've made vows. It is natural to communicate. What's unnatural is not to communicate. Now, here's why so many remarriages and blended families don't make it. Yeah, children's the number one, but here's another. I'm going to help you with this. So listen to this. Here's another. You are going to communicate. You will communicate. I just said it's natural. But the problem is that if you're not communicating with your spouse, you're going to communicate with someone else. Now, I'm telling you, after years and years of working in this space, this is true. If you're not going to communicate with your spouse, one, you'll communicate with your friends. That's fine. It's okay to communicate with friends. Not as your number one, though. So you'll communicate with someone. You'll find someone to communicate. Unfortunately, what also happens is that someone finds someone at work to communicate with, someone of the opposite sex, because they want to listen. They're kind, and it's a safe space, you feel like, and that just leads to trouble, as you can imagine. But those aren't the number one things. Here's the number one thing that happens when you do not communicate with your spouse. As a matter of fact, this is one of the things in marriage relationships, and especially in blended families, that saddens me the most, and I want to help you with. I want to ask you this question. I want you to be honest. I want to ask you this question. Do you see this happening right now in your family? This right here. If your spouse is not your number one, if your spouse is not the person that you're communicating with, that there's this mistrust and you need to trust someone. Do you know what most people do? They make a child their number one. They make a child their number one. They take one of their children, and that child becomes the person they trust. That child becomes the person they put their faith in and they communicate with. And do you know what happens to the child? Listen, the child is misplaced. If you're married and your spouse is not your number one person to communicate with, and you begin making your child that number one person to communicate with, and they take on that role for you, your number one, then you've misplaced your child. That's not the role God intended for them in your marriage, in your blended family. But when you do that, if you look at what that's going to do to that child in the future, you would put the brakes on right now and stop. So when you feel a lack of trust creeping in, and you know that you're beginning to withdraw from your spouse, you know you have to communicate more. That's what you know. You have to communicate more. Mistrust is almost always solved by better communication. So, do you realize that there's also a rule book for better communication? Just like there's a rule book for blended families, yeah, there's a whole rule book for better communication that would become foundational for your blended family. So in the next podcast, I'm going to give you the rule book for better communication. But for now, realize that mistrust creeps in, that better communication overcomes mistrust. Thank you for joining us. Let me ask you to do something. If you're enjoying these podcasts, go like it, share it, subscribe. We want to grow this and reach the blended families around this world and build a strong foundation.